my argument is not that escalating strategic competition, let alone conflict between the US and China, is inevitable. My argument is that that's a significant risk. And managing risks like that is a very important thing to do. Just because it's not inevitable doesn't mean you don't have to pay really careful attention to it. But I'd also press the point just a bit further, because, of course, you're absolutely right. Each side has an immense incentive to prevent this strategic competition getting in the way of their economic relationship, because they both really do depend on that. And what you would hope, in fact, what people have hoped since the late 18th century, is that trade brings peace, that as people trade, their inclination to...
They've got McDonald's, we've got McDonald's,
exactly,
we won't go to war. Exactly.
How could we go to war with one another? And it's a very important point. They are genuine incentives. They do provide very good reasons on both sides for people to avoid strategic confrontation. But what strikes me is how little that seems to actually affect people's approach. And I think the reason for that is twofold. The first is that because people so willingly grasp at that life belt and say, look, we don't have to worry about this. You know, we trade so much we can't go to war with one another. I think it actually stops them paying attention to what's going to be needed to prevent that happening. In a sense, it engenders a complacency. People don't think it's necessary to work hard to prevent escalating strategic competition because they sort of assume it's impossible, even while it's actually happening. But I think there's a deeper reason in that as well, and that is that both sides think that economics poses a real constraint on competition, but they think the constraint applies to the other guy and not to them. I spend quite a lot of time talking to Americans and Chinese about this, and a very common pattern of conversation is for the Americans to say, look, Hugh, you're way too worried about this stuff. You know, this strategic competition can't get out of hand. Why not? Well, the Chinese aren't going to be dumb enough to let that happen. And I talk to Chinese and they say, Hugh, you're way too pessimistic about this. The Americans just are not dumb enough to let this happen. The fact is they both think there's a golden straitjacket. This was Thomas Friedman's phrase. There's a golden straitjacket that nobody can afford to misbehave because everyone has to keep the money flowing. But the fact is they each think the other side's wearing the golden straitjacket. They each think that economics constrains the other side's strategic position and not theirs. And you know, I think the risk is that both sides will allow themselves to slide into a position where they expect the other side to respond to the economic constraints so they don't have to.
Now, I'm interested in what you think about what they've said publicly and officially. I mean, we'll have time to talk about what Australia should do, but you point to some of Obama's language. I think it's from his speech where he's talking about the troops in Afghanistan actually.
Yeah.
But just talk about his language and what do you think Obama means with his public pronouncements so far on China?
Well, I think, to me, one of the really distinctive things about the way in which this issue plays out is that both sides, both the US and China, avoid it publicly. They don't talk about it publicly. The Chinese do that as a deliberate act of policy. That is, they adopted a policy right back in the 1980s that as their power grew, their challenge was going to be to stop people getting anxious about their power. So, and Deng Xiaoping had a slogan about this, you know, always understate our power, don't seek leadership, keep your head down, don't let them see how strong we're getting. And, you know, when everyone who deals with the Chinese on these issues is familiar with the Chinese saying, oh, we're a very poor country. I mean, they were saying that when they were the fifth strongest economy in the world, and they were still saying it when they were the fourth, and now they're the second strongest economy in the world. And they're still saying, oh, we're a very poor country. No, you're not. So I think they deliberately suppress the conversation. And there's a reason for that. From China's point of view, the later the negotiation happens, the better off they are. Because the balance, you know, time is working on their side. On America's side, something different's happening. I think Americans have found it very difficult to come to terms with the strategic implications of China's growing power, have found it hard to come to terms with the probability that they will not be the strongest economy in the world 20 or 30 years from now. They, I think, would anyway find that hard to come to terms with, and I don't blame them for that. But I think 9/11 made that even harder to come to terms with. It's been a massive distraction. I have a kind of a tentative hypothesis that it may well be the biggest long-term strategic implication of the 9/11 attacks will be that it made it almost impossible for America to respond more effectively to what really was the biggest strategic challenge they faced over this era. And so I think there's what you don't see in the United States is a clear articulation of how America should respond, because there's a very strong assumption in the United States that they will remain the dominant power in Asia, even as the economic relativities shift. And I think 2009 was the year in which that pattern started to break up. And you can see this in Obama's, when Barack Obama announced the surge of troops to Afghanistan, a speech in West Point on the 1st of December last year. Most of the headline, most of the attention was on the fact that he announced an extra 30,000 troops and then simultaneously announced a deadline for withdrawal. But he had a passage in the speech in which he explained why that was so. And I don't want to verbal the bloke, but roughly speaking, he said, we, America, can no longer assume we've got enough power to do everything we want. There are some very big, tough competitors out there, and for us to be sure that we can play the kind of role we want to play in the world in future, we're going to have to husband our resources much more carefully. Therefore, we need to get out of Afghanistan.
And he said prosperity provides a foundation for our power. Which
exactly.
Is exactly
That's exactly it. And he didn't mention China, but he did in 2009. He didn't have to. This was the year. I mean, I think one of the things that drew China to the centre of America's attention in 2009, perhaps the most important thing, was the global financial crisis. I think that was the point at which Americans really turned around and realised just how big and strong and powerful China had become.
Okay, look, now I want to... I love the Australian because they're just great fodder. I so don't agree with their
They love me
view,
too,
But they just, sometimes they know how to say outrageous things. I do, if you didn't manage to catch Greg Sheridan's views on Hugh's essay, some of his choice lines that Hugh has written the single stupidest strategic document ever prepared in Australian history by someone who once held a position of some responsibility. And what was the other? There was another great one. White determines that the chief task for Australian diplomacy is to persuade the Americans to give up their Asian primacy. This is, without question, the single dumbest suggestion for Australian foreign policy from a once mainstream character in many a long year. I love it. My personal opinion of the Australians, they fire about 100 bullets, and if they know that if 3 hit their target, they've sort of done their job. With that as a starting point, and feel free to respond, what does it mean? How do you think most people here in government are responding to what you've said?
Yep.
And what are the different choices that Australia might take?
Look, this is a very difficult issue for Australia. And, and it's a difficult issue for me. It's a pretty important point from my point of view. I am not, in any sense, an anti-American person. I've spent most of my career working in and around government.
But there are some very serious people who would agree with what Greg says and would see that you're sort of an unknowing anti-American.
Well, I would resist that, I think. I think that there's a very strong presumption. Let me put this a different way. The US alliance has been fantastically good for Australia, hitherto. American uncontested primacy has worked very well for us. And although there are things that Americans do that lots of people don't like, on balance, American power has been very, very good for Australia indeed. And the US alliance has worked very well for Australia indeed. Now, the problem for us is that the circumstances in which the US alliance worked well are starting to change. I take a very positive view of what the US alliance does, but I take a rather cool view of why it does it. It's easy to see the US alliance, particularly when the way it's often talked about, that is virtues derived from sort of deep intrinsic features of the shared values and histories and culture and all of that sort of stuff. I've never seen the alliance that way. I've always seen the alliance as a cost-effective strategic policy instrument for Australia in particular strategic circumstances. I therefore think that if the circumstances change, our view of the alliance might change. It's worth making the point that it's no part of my argument that we should dump the alliance. My argument is that we should think very carefully about what are the circumstances in Asia how will our approach to the alliance change as circumstances in Asia change. And I recognise that there are some circumstances in which the alliance might not be the right thing for us. I don't advocate that those circumstances are the one we want to bring about. But underlying this most profoundly is that I do think there is a kind of timidity or denial going on in some of this. Australians are absolutely convinced that that we can model the future of our economy on the assumption that China will keep growing indefinitely. But many Australians are also convinced that we can continue to assume that the United States will retain uncontested primacy in Asia indefinitely. And my simple proposition at the heart of my essay is that these can't both be true at once. if China grows far enough and fast enough to deliver to us what we expect economically, it will grow far enough and fast enough to render American uncontested primacy unsustainable. Now, when Greg and others, I think it's fair to say, when they look at my argument, they say, but we don't want this to happen. We want America to remain the dominant power in Asia. And I, frankly, and I say this in the essay in words of one syllable, I would too. If I could have my choice, if somebody asked me to tick a box, I would say continued US primacy is the best outcome for Australia by far, but that's not what's going to happen if China keeps growing. The question for us is not do we want that to keep happening. The question is what's the best possibility for us if that doesn't happen? And I do think we're now increasingly in a world in which that outcome is very unlikely. So part of my response to Greg is I'm not advocating that the United States should give up primacy if it doesn't have to. I'm saying that giving up primacy might be the best outcome for creating a stable Asia, and it could well be the best outcome for the United States. The proposition that the United States' best interests are served by entering into a deep and bitter, protracted and possibly warlike strategic competition with the world's second strongest economy doesn't seem to me to be self-evidently the best thing for them.
So you propose this sort of, your best future option is this concert of Europe idea, sort of sharing of interests. Yeah. And because we don't have a well-enunciated China policy from our current Prime Minister, let's go back to the then Prime Minister, current Foreign Minister's policy, and two things. One, the Asian community idea, and two, lots of new submarines.
Yes.
Are these two things, is that the right way for Australia to go? Is that going to get us to that sort of sharing of power in Asia?
I think it's quite natural and perhaps inevitable that our policy response to this is going to be complicated. And there are going to be at least two components to it. The first is I think Australia should take as a very serious national objective doing what we can to foster the development of a strategic order in Asia, particularly the relationship between the strongest states, which suits us, which is good for Australia. And I think that's one in which the United States continues to play the strongest possible role it can in Asia, consistent with avoiding intensifying strategic competition with China. And my model for how that can be done is with this kind of model of a shared power structure in which the US and China and Japan and India all participate. And I use the model of 19th century Europe as a kind of a image of how that might work. And I think that's a very significant diplomatic task for us. I think Kevin Rudd, when he developed the Asia-Pacific community concept, certainly did, as part of that idea, he had in mind the thought that one of the things the APC should do is to help negotiate this new order. I think that was simply ill-conceived as a diplomatic initiative because the idea of the APC was that you're going to have every country in the region, or a lot of countries in the region, I forget the number, 22 or 23, all together in the room, the big ones and the small ones and so on. And it's an iron law of diplomacy, as it is of most other walks of life, that no committee ever got better as it got bigger. And the idea that the US and China would sit down and negotiate their future relationship with another 20 countries in the room, all in a sort of a grand ballroom in a hotel in Singapore somewhere behind the crossed flags with little bowls of mints in front of them. This didn't sound right to me. This was going to be a very different kind of conversation. So I think one thing one might say is that Rudd was trying to deal himself into that conversation directly. And I think that's a misunderstanding of what's going on. I do think there is something Australia should do. Australia should go to Washington and go to Beijing and encourage others to go to Washington and Beijing and saying, we want Asia to look like this. We don't want it to look like that. But I don't think it's a matter of convening everyone in a room together. So there is a diplomatic story. And as so often with Rudd, the idea of the Asia-Pacific community indicated that he had the right idea about what needed to be done, but it also indicated it didn't work out how best to make it happen.
And just before we open it up to questions, the subs, is that
the other side of the coin, as I said, there are two things we need to do. The first thing is we need to try and do what we can to help foster the Asia that works for us best. The second is, I think in all responsibility, is we've got to work out what do we do if it doesn't work out like that. If Asia for the next 40 years is as peaceful as Asia's been for the last 40 years, then we don't need any submarines. The whole point about defence policy, at least those bits of defence policy, you might say you need an army to do odds and sods of things. But the big, expensive, scary stuff, the Joint Strike Fighters, the submarines and all of that, we only need them if Asia's strategic order becomes more contested. But if Asia's strategic order becomes more contested, if we don't get a nice, stable concert of power model, then Australia does have to think very carefully about what kind of role it wants to play in that very different kind of Asia, and what kind of role we want our armed forces to be able to play in establishing our position in that kind of Asia, and therefore what kind of armed forces we need. And without going too far into the technicalities of force structuring, my argument, and this is an argument about there's a lot of steps in this which I'm missing out, but my basic argument is that the kinds of strategic objectives that Australia would want to be able to achieve in a more contested Asia are ones that are best achieved with submarines. So I myself would put a big priority on submarines. The difference between me and Kevin Rudd on submarines is not that the 12 that he nominated in his 2009 white paper were too many, but that there were too few and too late, if you believe that we're heading to...
Just explain the emphasis on submarines. Why submarines?
Okay.
Because at first glance... because I never really understood it myself until I read your essay.
Don't tempt me. This is my favourite subject in the whole world. I can get boring on this subject, but let me give you the short version. Australia is a fundamentally maritime strategic environment. We tend to think of ourselves, when we think of Australia militarily, we think of the army. But that's an accident of history. Geography tells us, the blue on the map tells us, that we're a country which, if it's going to exercise strategic weight in Asia, it's going to do it at sea. And it's not just the geography, it's also demographics and so on. Australia is never going to be, unless we replicate the achievements of our ancestors in 1914-18, we're never going to deploy a mass army, and we shouldn't deploy a mass army. It gets you to the War Memorial. We should aim, and we can most cost effectively exercise strategic weight in Asia at sea. Now, what do you want to do at sea? There are two broad propositions. One is you can try and control the sea, so you can send aircraft carriers and amphibious ships and so on around the joint. I think Australia will be very ill-advised to spend money trying to build sea control capabilities, because it's incredibly hard and it's going to get harder. I think we're going to enter an era in the Western Pacific in which no country, not even the United States, can achieve and sustain sea control for strategically significant periods of time in operationally significant places. The most you can do is denial. That is, stop the other guy using the sea. But the beauty of having an island continent, and not just an island continent, but an island continent in a very archipelagic place in the world, is that in a very contested Asia, and Asia looks very different from the Asia we've grown up in, but in a very contested Asia, being able to achieve sea denial for a country like Australia actually does a lot for us. And I have an argument that we can achieve our core strategic objectives, defend our most important strategic interests with operations primarily focused around achieving sea denial, and submarines are the most cost-effective way of doing sea denial.
Sure.
My many friends in the Army and many of my friends in the Navy, that is the ones who sail surface ships, would disagree with that argument. I'm pretty confident of it.
Okay. Look, thanks, Hugh. I really enjoyed reading that, actually, and surprisingly, I don't actually often go back over things. I had to go back over it to think about what I was going to ask you. So I learned something reading that. I'm sure there are people here who want to ask Hugh a few questions. I think we've got some microphones. Yep, I can see a few people. So I don't know if we can get to the gentleman closest to me there, and then there's a bloke behind, and the bloke in front of him after that. Sure, go for it. No, go for it.
Professor White, Courtney Krause, ex-student of yours. Wondering about the criticisms from Stefan Freuling that you take it to much of an emphasis on the economic aspects of this, and not look at US's grand strategy of kind of achieving bilateral relationships and the kind of spoken wheel.
Yeah. No, it's a very good question, Courtney. Nice to see you. And you'll see that Stefan is one of my colleagues at SDSC. We debate these things pretty vigorously. One of the core questions from an American point of view about my view of this is I think America will be able to counteract China's growing power by attracting other countries in Asia to support it. And it's a very good proposition. And if you look at, well, Australia and Japan for a start, but India and Indonesia, and there's a lot of democracies in Asia that might very naturally gravitate to America's side, and there's a lot of other countries, even that are not democracies, like Vietnam, who are all very worried about China, so would naturally want to line up on America's side. And I do think that carries some weight, but much less than I think a lot of Americans, and for that matter a lot of Australians, assume. And the reason for that is that I think there's a risk of a difference in objective between America's Asian friends, including Australia, and America. Countries in Asia, and I absolutely include Australia in this, want the United States to stay engaged because they don't want to live in a region in which China can establish dominance. And they see American power as a very important constraint on what China can do with its power. But they also don't want to live in a region which is transformed and torn apart by strategic competition between the US and China. So what the countries in the region want, including Australia, is that we want the United States to stay engaged, to balance China, but we don't want it to enter into a strategic competition with China, which tears the region apart. So that's why I think a lot of countries in Asia would be very happy to see the United States stay here to balance, to be a member of this equal sharing partnership. Now, sharing partnership sounds sort of touchy-feely, but it's got a hard edge to it. Part of a sharing partnership like that is that it is the underlying expectation that if any one of the parties tries to break out of the partnership and dominate, they'll face the others. The other members of the partnership constrain the actions. And so I think countries in Asia, including Australia, are keen for America to stay in that role, but they're much less keen to see America stay around to sustain its primacy if that primacy is going to mean a deteriorating relationship with China. And if you look, the case of India is a particularly interesting one. Americans are very confident that India will remain a decisive strategic asset for America in its competition with China. And I think that's a complete misunderstanding of where the Indians are going, because India is undoubtedly a very important part of the picture. But Indians are not going to define their strategic objectives in Asia as being to support American primacy. They're going to want to maximise their own influence. They are becoming a great power in Asia. They'll want to use their power to support their position. So they'll want America to stay engaged so they don't face China too much alone, but they're not going to want to define their strategic objectives as supporting American primacy. So my bottom line on that is that yes, the countries of Asia are very keen for the United States to stay engaged, but no, they're not keen for the United States to stay engaged on the terms which America seems most likely to want to stay engaged. And that, I think, is a real dilemma for the region, including for us. And my sort of prescription for what Australia should do is, amongst other things, to go to Washington and say, we want you to stay engaged, but we don't want you to contest for leadership in Asia with China. We want you to stay engaged in that more modest way.
There was a question, just in front, and we'll try and get in too. So that gentleman there, and then there's the gentleman down here in a blue shirt as well.
Professor White, I thought in the essay one of the things that was understated was any debate about nuclear proliferation and nuclear abolition.
Yeah.
That American primacy in the region is based on nuclear primacy and the extended deterrence that Australia and Japan are based on.
Yeah.
Some of your colleagues at the Low Institute have always said that Australia should not take off the table the option of developing nuclear weapons itself. And there's certainly a lobby in Japan with the plutonium economy that Japan can go nuclear.
Yes.
And it seems to me that shouldn't we be bringing up the debate about nuclear abolition so that your concert of powers in Asia is a non-nuclear concert rather than one that could be triggered into warfare?
It's a very good question. There's somewhere on the disc in my office a whole other chapter on the nuclear aspects of this story, which ends up just getting too complicated to squeeze into the essay. But I do think the nuclear story is very important. One of the reasons for that is that I think we underestimate how significant nuclear weapons are in the relationship between the US and China, and how significantly they can contribute to the destabilisation of that relationship. And I absolutely agree that if you could if you could move towards abolition of nuclear weapons, that would make the management of these relationships much easier in the future. But I've got to say, at the risk of sounding like a kind of a sort of a cynical old strategist, that I think our chances of getting to abolition within the timeframes that are significant for the resolution of this issue, which is only the next couple of decades. We don't have very long on this. A decade's not very long in this business. And we've only got a couple at the most. We're not going to get to abolition in a couple of decades. So we need to build a stable order in which the US and China can get on without competing too much before we've got any real prospect of getting nuclear abolition. And in fact, I'd almost put the cart and the horse the other way around. If we can build that kind of relationship, then the prospects of the US and China's relationship evolving to the point where they both decided they could do without nuclear weapons would be that much greater. If they're drawn into a competitive relationship, the prospect of abolition is that much reduced. So I'd actually put the negotiation of a new order in Asia ahead of abolition rather than behind it, without for a moment saying that if we could get both eventually, that would be the best outcome.
Yes, my name is Jonathan Quaid.
You've got a microphone there, just so the people at the back can hear.
Yeah, Hugh, you speak and write as though Russia no longer has a place in the picture or a place at the table in Asia, even potentially, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Now, I don't necessarily challenge that, but I'd like you to address it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I do leave Russia out of my calculus of Asia's strategic future, and the reason for that, and I'll put it a bit bluntly, but I don't actually think Russia is going to function as a great power in Asia. And the reason for that is not that Russia doesn't have some very significant aspects of national power, including, of course, huge territories in Asia, but that Russia's principal strategic interests and its principal strategic risks and opportunities, for that matter, are in Europe, to the west and to the south. I think for Russia, viewed from Moscow, overwhelmingly the big issue is how they manage their relationship with Europe. And I think that's going to absorb all of Russia's strategic energies, if I can put it that way. And then the second issue is how they manage their relationships south into the Middle East, which are an immensely complex set of questions. And it does seem to me that the Far East, in Russian terms, just comes off third best. I don't think Russia is strong enough, at least in anything like its present economic configuration, to be able to function as a great power simultaneously in all three of those theatres. And I think the Far East will be at number 3. One of the reasons I say that is not just that, so to speak, the Western Front for Russia and the Southern Front closer to the heartland. It's also that the adversaries that China faces in the Far East are so daunting. Russia can exercise very significant strategic weight vis-a-vis the Ukraine or Poland or the Baltic states or even Iran or Turkey. But vis-a-vis China, no. I think China's too big for Russia to take on. So I think both its interests and its opportunities are going to draw it to the other end, to the other end of its empire. Having said that, I do think that Russia constitutes a wild card in some scenarios and some calculations. In the event of a US-China conflict, and I don't want to be too gloomy about this, and I'm not for a moment predicting that such a conflict is going to occur, but it's important to think about these possibilities to get them clear in your mind. And in the event of a US-China conflict, the attitude of Russia could become very important simply because it has all those nukes. And it would be a factor in both China's and America's strategic calculations, which I think would be potentially quite destabilising. I think the fact that Russia's there as well would make the strategic nuclear calculation between the US and China more complicated, even than it would otherwise be. So it has a sort of a place at the table, but it's a rather mysterious one.
I think I'm going to wrap it up there, but Hugh is going to be signing, I think you are going to be signing some copies at the back there if you want to have a chat to him and get a book signed. I'd just like to say it's great to see you not on a blue screen on Lateline, but in the flesh, and also great that the Wheeler Centre and Black Ink are here so that we can perhaps, even with an election campaign like that happened to only skate along the surface of lots of really big things, we can get into some of these big discussions. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Black Ink. Thank you, the Wheeler Centre. And Hugh is up the back there if you'd like to get a signed copy and have a chat to him. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.